Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I'm your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dry cases, guys. These are the ones where the facts may seem clear, but the truth, well, that's another story. Here, we're going to dive into a case that captivated the world, a murder in the heart of Italy, two young suspects, and a trial that blurred the line between truth and perception. Despite multiple verdicts, overturned convictions, and exoneration, the public still struggles to accept what the evidence has proven. Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito are innocent. But why is that? Why is it that even after both of these people were cleared of all charges, many around the world continue to see them as guilty? Is it the media's portrayal? Is it their behavior during the trial? Or is it a psychological tendency we all share as humans? One that leads us to seek guilt even when the facts say otherwise. This case is going to challenge you to consider how perception shapes reality and why the truth can be so hard to accept, even when it doesn't align with what we think we know. Listen closely as we unravel the evidence, the court's findings, and the public's lingering doubts. By the end of this episode, you are going to have a chance to decide for yourself. Here in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion, we ask Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito, guilty in the eyes of the public or innocent in the eyes of the law? The murder of Meredith Kercher. It was a brutal and tragic event that sent shockwaves around the world. Meredith, a British exchange student, was found dead in the apartment she shared with Amanda Knox in Italy on November 1st in 2007. She had been sexually assaulted and stabbed, and her body was discovered partially covered by a duvet. From the beginning, the investigation had holes, inconsistencies, and questionable practices. The Italian police, facing international pressure to solve the case, zeroed in on Amanda Knox and her then-boyfriend, Raffaele. As suspects, Amanda was portrayed by the media as strange and emotionally distant, while Raffaele was seen as equally suspect because of his close involvement with her. Amanda's behavior at times seemed odd and inconsistent, and it didn't help her case. When police questioned her, she initially blamed a local bar owner, Patrick Lumumba, for the murder. This accusation, though, turned out to be completely false, and it led to a wrongful arrest. And the media quickly latched onto Amanda's mistakes, and she ended up being portrayed as a cold and detached woman, even callous. The infamous footage of her doing cartwheels in the police station became a symbol of her presumed guilt. And meanwhile, Raffaele, though less visible in the media, he was also painted as a suspicious figure. His quiet, almost detached demeanor made people wonder if he too was involved. The public and the press, they were fixated on the idea that this young couple, swept up in some sort of dark fantasy or sexual game, had murdered Meredith. But as the investigation progressed, cracks began to form in the case against Knox and Sollecito. The DNA evidence, which the prosecution leaned heavily on, turned out to be unreliable. Crucial evidence, like the knife said to be the murder weapon, lacked a solid DNA link to the crime scene. And furthermore, the forensic experts criticized how the crime scene had been handled, calling into question whether any of the physical evidence could be trusted at all. Despite this, though, both Amanda and Raffaele were convicted in 2009. Knox received a sentence of 26 years, and Sollecito was sentenced to 25 years in prison. But the story didn't end there. In 2011, Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito's convictions were overturned on appeal. The Italian courts ruled that the DNA evidence used against them was unreliable, and the handling of the crime scene raised serious doubts about the integrity of the investigation. Both Knox and Sollecito were released, but the public's perception to their exoneration was far from one of relief or closure. Instead, many people doubled down on their belief that Knox and Sollecito were guilty. Their acquittal did not align with the carefully crafted narrative of their guilt, one that had been built up over the years of intense media coverage. For some, it was not just the evidence that mattered here. It was the way Amanda acted, the way she smiled or appeared detached during interviews. It was the way Raffaele seemed unemotional, or maybe he was too calm for someone accused of such a heinous crime. The media had played a significant role in shaping this perception. Throughout the trial, sensationalized headlines focused on Knox's nickname, Foxy Knoxy, and speculated about her sexual behavior, as if that alone made her capable of murder. But did anyone notice? Sollecito, too, was cast as complicit simply because of his close relationship with Knox. Public opinion was swayed not by facts on this one, guys, but by impressions. The story had become bigger than the truth. Even after their acquittal, the case was retried in 2014, an unprecedented move in the Italian legal system. The public's demand for justice, or perhaps confirmation of their belief in Knox and Sollecito's guilt, pushed the case back into the courts. Can you believe it? That is the power. Although they were briefly reconvicted, this decision was again overturned in 2015 by Italy's highest court, which fully exonerated them both. But by then, the damage had been done. The public, both in Italy and abroad, remained skeptical. For many, Knox and Sollecito's behavior during the trial continued to define them, overshadowing the actual facts of the case. No amount of legal clarity seemed able to erase the public's lingering belief that these two had somehow gotten away with murder. This case, while legally resolved, fully resolved more than once, left an unresolved question. Why does the public struggle so deeply with accepting Knox and Sollecito's innocence? Is it because their innocence clashes with the story we've been told? Or is it a reflection of our own biases and need for a narrative that fits our expectations? I mean, come on, guys. When we hear something one time, is that the only impression we get? You hear it once and you believe it and you just can't change your mind ever again? What is going on here? In the original trial, the prosecution painted Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito as cold, calculating murderers. They argued that Meredith Kercher's death was the result of a violent sexual game gone wrong, with Knox and Sollecito at the center. The prosecution's narrative was seductive in its simplicity. Two lovers caught up in drugs and sex spiraled into murder. Great. For the public, this was a story that was easy to grasp, full of all the elements that make good headlines: young love, jealousy, and betrayal. However, the evidence didn't fully support this theory. The prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence, specifically a knife that was found in Sollecito's kitchen, which was said to have traces of both Knox and Kercher's DNA. But that evidence, as the defense argued, was contaminated. The defense also pointed out the inconsistencies in witness testimony and the glaring mistakes made in the collection of forensic evidence. The defense, they argued that Rudy Guede, a local man with a history of petty crime, was the sole perpetrator. His DNA was the only one found in a significant amount at the crime scene, and his fingerprints were on Meredith's belongings. He fled the country shortly after the murder, which seemed like a clear admission of guilt. Guede was eventually convicted of Meredith's murder, but his conviction was still not enough to clear Knox and Sollecito in the eyes of the public. Why? Because the defense's argument, while backed by evidence, well, it lacked the drama and the intrigue of the prosecution's story, and that's the story that stuck. For the public, the other stuff, well, it just wasn't as compelling. Knox and Sollecito's behavior, their perceived lack of remorse, Knox's cartwheels in the police station, and the false accusation of Patrick Lumumba fed into the idea that something just was not right with these two, even when the defense presented facts that dismantled the prosecution's case. Many people were done. They had already made up their minds, and that was it. But in the end, it wasn't the strength of the prosecution's evidence, that kept Knox and Sollecito in the public's crosshairs, which is something you might have thought. No, this was the power of a narrative that the public just simply could not let go of. The argument of innocence clashed with the perception of guilt, and for many, perception won. Inside the courtroom, the prosecution and defense were laying out their arguments. Evidence was being presented. Witnesses were being called, and the complex legal process was unfolding as it should. But outside the courtroom, in the public sphere, something very different was happening. Perception was being shaped, and not by facts, but by a media machine hungry for a captivating narrative. Let's start with the forensic evidence. In court, the key pieces of evidence against Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were a kitchen knife found in Sollecito's apartment and traces of Amanda's DNA supposedly found on the handle, while Meredith's DNA was claimed to be on the blade. There was also a bra clasp found at the crime scene with Raffaele's DNA on it. These pieces of evidence formed the foundation for the prosecution's case. However, under scrutiny, they quickly began to fall apart. The knife didn't have a clear enough DNA link to the crime scene, and it had been improperly handled. The bra clasp, on the other hand, had been left at the crime scene for weeks before being collected, compromising its integrity. In court, the defense raised all of these issues, pointing out how the investigation had been mishandled. DNA experts testified that the contamination of evidence was a significant problem, and witnesses for the defense methodically dismantled the prosecution's case, piece by piece. Yet none of this seemed to sway the public at all. While this was happening in court, the media continued to fuel a very different story, and that's for the public. Headlines weren't talking about contaminated evidence or questionable forensic practices like they were actually doing in court. They were focused on Knox's odd behavior and salacious details about her personal life. Amanda's nickname, Foxy Knoxy, that was splashed across headlines across the globe, turning her into a figure of fascination and suspicion. The public was not hearing about the inconsistencies in the evidence. They were hearing about Amanda's cartwheels, her relationship with Sollecito, and her brief false accusation of Patrick Lumumba. To many, she did not seem like an innocent young woman fighting for her life in court. She seemed indifferent and strange, and capable of murder. Similarly, Raffaele Sollecito was portrayed as the loyal yet complicit boyfriend, standing by Knox throughout the trial. His quiet, reserved nature was misinterpreted as coldness, and the public began to view him as just as guilty as Amanda, despite the lack of concrete evidence tying him to the crime. The media, more interested in a sensational story than any forensic evidence, they made it easy for the public to form a solid opinion based on perception rather than any fact. So while the courtroom was full of debate about the reliability of evidence and the mistakes in the investigation, the public was focused on a completely different narrative, one shaped by sensationalism, character judgment, and the desire to believe in a scandalous crime. And there are a lot of you out there right now that are thinking, well, not me, right? Because none of us want to believe that we can be influenced by someone else in any of our decisions that mean something to us. And murder certainly does. We would rather believe that we're right than understand that the public itself was manipulated into doing something that who knows what the motivation was. But boy, it sure made for good headlines. That was the motivation, maybe. And all of us fell for it, didn't we? The public in general. We watch the news. We comment on the stories. We hang with our friends in agreement. And all the while, we may have no idea what even happened, but the public doesn't have any interest in searching for the truth, it would seem. They would rather listen and get excited about what they're hearing. And that's what happened in this case. As the trial progressed, the courtroom became a battleground for the defense's effort to counter the prosecution's flimsy narrative. Piece by piece, the defense team dismantled the idea that Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito had been involved in Meredith Kercher's murder. Crucially, the defense pointed to the presence of another man, Rudy Guede, whose DNA was found all over that crime scene. Guede, known as a petty criminal, had already fled the country shortly after the murder, and when captured, he admitted to being in Meredith's room the night that she died. Guede's DNA was the only conclusive link to that crime scene. But who knows that? I mean, despite these developments in court, the public's perception remained fixated on Knox and Sollecito. Why? Because the media continued to spotlight their behavior rather than the crumbling evidence against them. Headlines still blared about Amanda Knox's lack of emotion or her inconsistent statements to the police. The public could not shake the idea that if Knox had falsely accused someone once, Patrick Lumumba, she could easily be lying about her own innocence now. And this idea was played up by the press, which fed into the public's growing belief that these two were guilty no matter what was being discussed in court. When the DNA evidence was revealed to be compromised, and when it became clear that Rudy Guede was in fact the true culprit, one would think the public's opinion would start to shift. But in this case, it did not. The public wasn't hearing about Rudy Guede's role in the crime. They were still being fed stories about Knox's bizarre behavior, her alleged promiscuity, and the so-called depraved nature of the crime. The press clung to the narrative they had built, and so did the public. The courtroom might have been slowly building a case for innocence, but the public was still focused on a story of guilt. By the time the trial neared its conclusion, Knox and Sollecito had been cast as villains in the eyes of many. Villains whose guilt seemed more true because of their personalities and actions rather than any facts. For many people, the truth was already decided, and no amount of forensic evidence or legal arguments or anything else was going to change that. While Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito were fighting for their freedoms in the courtroom in Italy, the public around the world was battling a different kind of war. It was a battle against their own perceptions. The media had already painted that picture of guilt, and so for many people, that image was just too compelling to let go of, no matter how much evidence was presented to the contrary. In many ways, the public became victims of this perception, unable to see beyond the headlines and the character judgments that were made by the press. Throughout the trial, the sensationalist media coverage often overshadowed the legal proceedings. But the public might not see this as it's happening. Knox's behavior was picked apart in every single article, with very little attention being paid to the forensic evidence that was slowly unraveling in court. Sollecito, too, was dragged through the public's eye. His quiet demeanor was used against him, and in the midst of this, a very real truth was lost. There was no concrete evidence tying either one of these guys to the crime, neither Knox or Sollecito. But why didn't the public see this? Why did so many people remain convinced of Knox and Sollecito's guilt? Well, the answer lies in the nature of perception. Once a narrative is established, especially one as powerful as the idea of two young lovers entangled in a brutal murder, it becomes incredibly difficult to dismantle. The public had already bought into the story, and with constant media reinforcement, that story only grew stronger. Think back to when this case was unfolding. Maybe you're someone that was able to follow it. Maybe you're someone that got interested in it later or ran across it. But if you were getting into any of it, what was your perception of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito? Did you feel that they were guilty from the start? Were you swayed by the headlines? And before you say absolutely not, just think again, because the truth is many of us fall victim to the narratives that we are presented with, especially when those narratives feed into our emotional responses. When faced with a case as gruesome as Meredith Kercher's murder, it's human nature to want someone to blame. This is horrible. We want this fixed, and we want to put it over there. And Amanda Knox, with her calm composure, and Raffaele with his quiet presence, they were such easy targets. In this sense, though, the public became victims of perception, locked into a narrative that was more engaging and emotionally satisfying than the facts themselves. Knox and Sollecito's innocence didn't fit the story people wanted to believe. And so for many, it was just easier to cling to the idea that they were guilty. Some of that instant gratification, and of course, the bad guy goes away. Great, I feel good, on to more things. This is how we instantly look at something, package it up, decide, and move on. These are people's lives. I mean, even now, years after their exoneration, public opinion remains divided. This is a testament to how deeply ingrained these perceptions have become. When the public decides and they feel like they're all together on something, they really don't want to move. This is true for purchasing things, for policies, for politics, for pretty much anything that we can be divided on, which is really everything. It's just more comfortable to be where the majority lies. It's quieter, there's less fighting, it seems to make sense, and you can just move on with your wonderful self. But that's not how it is when you're on the other side of it. And maybe if one of us, you, were in court for murder, would you want the perception of the media controlling your fate? What about those facts? For Amanda Knox, the years following her exoneration, they've been anything but peaceful. Despite being fully acquitted by the Italian courts, she remains, in the eyes of many, forever linked to the murder of Meredith Kercher. As an American living in a highly publicized international trial, Knox became a symbol of something far bigger than herself, a focal point for debates about guilt and innocence and the power of media narratives. After her release, Knox returned to the U.S., where she's tried to rebuild her life. She has written books, spoken out about wrongful convictions. She's advocated for criminal justice reform. But no matter how much time has passed for Amanda Knox, she can never truly escape the shadow of her past. And for her, it's a shadow with a light at the end of it, but the public only sees the shadow. For many, the name Amanda Knox, it still conjures up images of a scandal, suspicion, and guilt, even though the courts have long since cleared her. Why isn't everyone celebrating? Imagine a life, despite legal vindication, you are still seen as guilty by a significant portion of the public. And you're not really living in a television. You're actually out there in the world where you see the public and they react to you. Knox has spoken openly about the emotional toll it has taken on her, how the public's inability to separate her from this crime, it's made it extremely difficult for her to move on. Every interview she does, every public appearance comes with the unspoken weight of the past. In the years since her acquittal, Knox has been trying very hard to reclaim her own narrative. But for someone who is so deeply entangled in this story of guilt, it's always an uphill battle. Even now, she must contend with the fact that for many, she's always going to be Foxy Knoxy. How would you like that? A character created by the media, people that don't even know you. And then it's seared into the public's consciousness, all so that we can sell magazines and watch the news? What other motivation could there be? As we close this episode, it's time to turn the lens back on you guys, the listeners. Now that we've walked through the facts of this case, the court findings, the media's influence, it's important to ask yourself, where did your perception of Amanda Knox and Raffaele Sollecito come from? Were you following the case at the time? And if so, what shaped your opinion? Was it the evidence presented in court? Was it the media narrative that dominated the headlines? If you were to go online and look it up right now, what are you going to find? It's easy to fall into the trap of believing a story simply because it's the one we hear the most. Maybe it's the one that feels us safe at home. When the story is filled with drama and intrigue and suspense, it becomes harder to separate fact from fiction. You're invested, you've been hooked. But in cases like this one, where the stakes are so high and lives hang in the balance, it's essential to step back and examine the truth, something the public these days doesn't really do. Who researches what we hear anymore? Anybody? And if people are not going and checking the facts in a world that's online where anyone can say anything, and we have a media that can tell us anything, like in this case, what does that say about the public? Do they care about any knowledge at all? Or is it just fun to think that you know something and that you care about something? It's tough. It's a tough question. But it is essential to look at the actual facts, because otherwise the public can be manipulated just like anybody else. And that's a question right there. Do we allow ourselves to be manipulated by the stories we are told, even when the facts point us in a different direction? In the case of Amanda and Raffaele, the evidence told one story, and the public's perception told another story. The courts, after years of legal battles, ruled that Knox and Sollecito were innocent, but public opinion did not follow suit. They refused. And so the question remains, were you also a victim of perception? As we reflect on this case, it is important to acknowledge that the real tragedy here is the loss of Meredith Kercher's life, and that justice was served with the conviction of Rudy Guede. But it is equally important to understand how powerful narratives can shape our views in the public, and how those narratives can sometimes blind us to the truth. And sometimes the public perception does pressure the legal system. But that's another story. So as we conclude this episode, I invite you to critically think about the stories you hear, the perceptions you hold, and the evidence behind them. In the court of public opinion, perception can often be stronger than fact. But it is up to us each of us to decide whether we are going to be swayed by that perception or whether we will look deeper to find the truth because that's what we deserve. Thank you for joining me on another case in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, guys. Stay out of trouble. Stay curious. And until next time, this is Alexis Knight.